Hello everyone. Sorry that it's been a while since I recorded the last video. Life has been busy. I'll still try to keep them going and hopefully more or less weekly, but sometimes there might be some delays. I had a thought of something I wanted to talk about a misunderstanding people seem to have about how science works. Or more precisely, a misunderstanding people have about singular opinions in science. So what I mean is that there is, you can see that people tend to like dissenters in science, especially if they fit whatever narrative they prefer to the general scientific narrative. And when people talk about this, then they might get out some famous examples where a dissenter over time actually was accepted as being correct. Most people like to quote Einstein because for many people he's the one scientist whose name they know. You could also name others. For example, in geology there was Alfred Wegener, who was the one who formulated the theory of continental drift, which was not accepted during his lifetime actually, and is generally accepted today. Or you could also name Ludwig Boltzmann, who was important in the development of statistical mechanics, which is basically the theory which, among other things, lets us understand and explain how heat works. So it is a fact that in the history of science there have been dissenters who weren't accepted by the scientific establishment and who in the end turned out to be correct. But they are the exception. Usually science works by many scientists interacting and discussing, creating results based on scientific studies, based on theoretical calculations, and on a thinking process. And there is basically a discussion going on between many scientists. And the goal of this discussion is to get a better description of nature than before. So that is a very simple way to describe science. And of course, there are people involved, so there also are social effects, there are certain egos involved, and that is why in science there's a method people try to stick to kind of reduce the effect of those egos. You can see that there's many areas in science where there's actually open questions and where there's different opinions, but you can also see that over time many of those questions become settled, and then you can just see them basically as what everyone more or less accepts as being correct. Once in a while, something is found which questions this correctness, then people start discussing again. Personally, since I'm a physicist by training, I'm most aware of this in the history of physics, but this happens in every science, and so you can see that it's an ongoing process of scientists agreeing on a basic fact, and then realizing, okay, maybe this isn't as correct as we thought, and then moving on from there. But what usually also is the case, that if things are settled, usually they are still more or less correct and can be used. It's just that it turns out that they have to be adapted in some way. The big change where everything has to be thrown out of the window actually happens very seldomly in science. And often it is not a single person who creates such a change, but it's more a growing awareness that there's a hole in the theories before. Even if you look at Einstein and you see his great contributions to physics, things were brewing already when he made them. There were experiments which could not be explained. There were even some mathematical explanations, which then were also used by Einstein, for how this happened. But there was a conceptual step which he made, which is what made him famous. But arguably, this could have also been made by someone else, only it might have taken probably a longer time till it was made. So what does that mean for us in our everyday life when we're looking at what's going on in science and technology? Well, it means that we have to be a bit careful when we look at what's being put out there, because we have to realize if we hear a lone dissenter or a small group of people dissenting from established science, then they're most likely to be wrong. And that is why usually in science it is said that if you disagree with the majority, you have a higher requirement to prove your point than the majority. I mean, this is actually quite logical, because the assumption is that in most cases, if a majority agrees on something, then it's more likely to be correct than some minority opinion, especially when you're studying something which can be studied objectively. This is not like a political question, because in science, basically, you're trying to find a very good explanation for what's going on in nature. And you're trying to constantly improve this description. So whenever you're talking about something which is quite established and where a majority of scientists agree, then anyone dissenting that has the right to do this. But to be taken seriously, they need to have much stronger arguments than just disagreeing. And that is the requirement by the scientific community, that you need to have very strong evidence to be able to change the majority of the opinions of the other scientists. If you actually found some hole in a theory or some new effect which has never been observed, then you should be able to produce this evidence, and then over time your opinion will become the general opinion. If you're not able to do this, it won't. Now, there's many varieties of why this might not work. One is, of course, someone is just making things up. In this case, they won't be able to produce any evidence which meets scientific standards, and so they're thrown out. Another effect is that someone actually did an experiment or a calculation and something came out, but there was some mistake made. Again, the requirement is high if you show something unusual, and so other scientists will look at it with a lot of scrutiny, and they will demand that you have a very strong evidence if it's something which is not expected. If you really found something, you should be able to produce it. If you didn't, then over the repeated study, it will show up how that actually it's not something that is true, and so you won't be able to reproduce results, and so it will be thrown out. That's just the normal process. Again, it's also possible that you kind of are somewhere in between. You actually did find something. It's actually more or less serious, but you kind of made it look like more than it was. Again, a very high standard is required, and then this will also be found out. Now, from an outside view, this might look like there's like science is not like scientists might change their mind or something like that, but actually there's a high standard for this, so as to really be sure that the things that science puts out there are correct. if we're outside of a settled field, then we will see this process going on, and if there's not much known about some phenomenon, then of course there will be many different opinions. And so the opinions will change in a short time frame. This is something you can actually observe in the corona pandemic, where you can see that if you look at it over time, that the general opinions of scientists are changing. So there's certain things which have actually not changed since the beginning. For example, what kind of virus it is, and how to generally describe this kind of virus, and that it's a disease, and that it can kill people. Other things are changing over time because new data is collected, new studies are being made, different approaches are being tested, different medication is being tested. And so you can see that there is a general improvement all the time of the understanding of what's going on. This is purely from the scientific point of view. This is not about politics or anything, so this is just the science. You can also see that there are certain opinions out there which by the majority of scientists are not accepted, which is why they then require even harder evidence than they do anyways. Because in a new phenomenon like this, of course everyone needs to produce hard evidence. A lot of people are looking at things, at different aspects, and they're collecting it, and they're forming their opinion over time. That is also one uncomfortable truth about the scientific process. It actually needs time. So even though we actually understand a lot in the ongoing process, probably a full understanding of, for example, a new disease will only be reached after many years. Though actually like the general lines you of course can also see during the process. But the details you'll probably only be able to figure out in retrospect. Or better to prove in retrospect, because you're figuring it out now, and then in retrospect you will have to do stronger analysis to be sure that everything is correct in the way it is. Now, in, for example, this ongoing pandemic, you can see that a lot of different opinions are out there, and you can already start to kind of sort minority and majority opinions. And you can see that some minority opinions are actually making things up. Some of them are seriously trying, and they're producing results which are now being put to scrutiny. In several cases, the scrutiny turned out that they were wrong. In some cases, the scrutiny turned out that it's interesting to look at. Actually, if you see something posted, like some miracle cure or anything, if you see it posted online, or if you hear some political pundits say it, sadly to say, in most cases I'm aware of, they turn out to be wrong. So, what does that mean for us? Well, it means that actually when we look at science and some scientific finding, we should not focus on the dissenters, on the unusual opinions, because in most cases they turn out to be wrong. But we should focus on the majority agreements in science. And even during the process, those things that the majority agrees on are most likely true. We can still listen to the dissenters, but we have to be aware that they're most likely wrong. Now, depending on how sure findings are, this is different degrees. And you can see if you can find only very few people speaking for a certain point of view, then you should check what the majority says, if they're in agreement or not. And you should also check what kind of interests they have, because your interests influence what you think. And it might be motivated reasoning, it might even be lying, that influences what people put out there. So be careful. Be careful believing lone dissenters in science. They're not necessarily wrong, but they're most likely to be wrong. And especially if, for example, they work for an oil company and they argue against climate change, they're probably not the best source because they have an automatic bias. If they're trying to sell you something based on their beliefs, they're probably somewhat biased. Just stay safe, be careful, remain critical, but always remember, being critical does not mean being against some majority opinion. Being critical means looking at evidence, and if the evidence turns out that the majority is correct, then you believe the majority. If it turns out the minority is correct, you believe the minority. But also remember, you need to be able to actually understand the evidence. If you want to look at scientific results, you need to understand how science works. In many cases, you also need to understand a certain degree of math, especially of statistics. And you also need to understand how does it fit in the general picture, and is this like a very unlikely thing or a very likely thing, because that influences how strong the evidence you need to require is. If you manage to do this, then you can build a more or less valid picture of what the science is saying. If you're not able to do it, you should be very careful when judging scientific findings or facts. Even if you are able to do it, if you have a truly scientific mindset, you should always remain open to being proven wrong. Not have a belief 100%, but have a belief depending on how well established things are, somewhere between 99, or for some things more than 99, but never 100%. And for not so well established things, if you believe them, it should be more than 50, probably. Personally, I try to have something roughly about 60% before I take it too seriously, and then being aware that this might very well change over time. So that's it for today. I hope this is helpful for you. I hope I'll be able to record more videos in the future. Everyone stay safe, stay healthy. Work on your critical thinking all the time. It's never finished. I also have to work on this all the time in myself. And until next time, goodbye.